Okay, over the past few lectures where I talked about migrations, I explained that Entity Framework Code First is based on convention over configuration, which means you can stick to the conventions and have less configuration, which makes your source code cleaner and more maintainable. But there are times that you don't like the conventions that come out of the box in Entity Framework, and you want to overwrite them. So in this lecture, I'm going to introduce you to two ways to overwrite these conventions: data annotations and Fluent API. Now, in this lecture, I'm not going to get deep into data annotations or Fluent API. This is just a brief overview, so you get a feel for how they work. Then, over the next two lectures, I will cover data annotations and Fluent API in more detail. So, for the purpose of this lecture, let's take a look at the courses table in the database. Okay, here in SQL Server Management Studio, take a look at the description column. This column is of type nvarchar of max, and it's nullable. By convention, whenever you have a string property, Code First migrations create a column with the type nvarchar and make it nullable, because the string type in C# is nullable. Now, I want to override this convention. I want to make sure that every course has a description. So how do we do it? First, I'm going to show you how to do it with data annotations. So back to Visual Studio. Let's open up the course class. Okay, here's the auto-generated code that we got as part of reverse engineering our database. Now I'm going to apply a data annotation or an attribute on the description property. So this required attribute is defined in system.componentModel.dataAnnotations namespace. With ReSharper, I can resolve the namespace using Alt and Enter. If you don't have ReSharper, you need to manually add the namespace on top of the file. Okay, beautiful. Now, if we create another migration, you'll see that the definition of this column is going to be changed such that this column is no longer going to be nullable. So back to Package Manager console, add migration. This is a temporary migration, so I just call it foo. Okay, let's take a look at the migration. Look, the altered column method here changes the type of description column in the courses table to a string that is not nullable. Now, I'm not going to apply this migration now because I'm going to delete this data annotation and use Fluent API to achieve the same result. So back to Solution Explorer. Here's the migration. Just delete it. Just to clarify something, in an earlier lecture, I told you that if you make a mistake, you need to create another migration to revert your changes. But that does not apply in this context, because I have not run this migration on my database. When we run a migration, it's like a commit to the repository, so we cannot change or delete it. Okay, now back to the course class. I'm going to delete this data annotation and instead show you how to make this column required using Fluent API. So delete, save. We close this file. Now let's go to Solution Explorer. Here's our Pluto context. So this is our DB context. And look, here we've got a method onModelCreating. This method is defined in the base class DB context, and here we are overriding that. This is where we use Fluent API to override the conventions in Entity Framework. So if you look at this method, we already have two examples of Fluent API. Now these two examples are a little bit complex, and I'm going to cover them in a later lecture. For now, let me show you how to make that description property or column required. So we start with Model Builder, which is the object passed to this method. Now we use the entity method, and this is a generic method. So we specify the type of our entity, in this case, course. We can chain method calls here, and that's why this style is called Fluent API. because it has a Fluent style. You can chain methods and kind of make a story. So here I'm going to say dot property, and here we use a lambda expression to specify the target property. So T for the type goes to description. Now I got the description property. Again, we chain another method call here. Is required. Okay, save. Now let's create a migration. So add migration. Again, we call it foo because it's a temporary migration. Let's take a look here. Look, we got the exact same migration. So we can use Fluent API or data annotations. Now you might wonder which one is better. Well, let me put them side by side so we can have a more decent comparison. So look, on the left we've got data annotation example, and on the right side we've got the Fluent API. As you see, with data annotations, we write less code. It's simpler. But on the flip side, it's not very flexible. It works well for simple cases like making a property required or setting a length on a string, but when it comes to configuring relationship between classes, Fluent API is a lot more powerful. In fact, everything you can do with data annotations, you can do with Fluent API. Now, one thing I personally don't like about data annotations is that they pollute your domain classes with database knowledge. Look at this course class on the left side. Here, the table data annotation applied on the course class indicates that this class is mapped to a table in the database called courses. Now, this is not terribly bad, but there are data annotations like foreign key or index that are very database specific. I don't like to pollute my domain classes with the knowledge of database. I like a clean, persistence ignorant domain model with good separation of concern. But this is something that you usually aim for in an enterprise application. If you're building a simple application for a small audience, it's easier to use data annotations and write less code. But one thing that I highly recommend to you is no matter which approach you choose, just stick to that. Do not mix these two approaches. Entity Framework does not stop you from mixing these two approaches, but it complicates your maintenance. Because every time you want to check a configuration, you have to look in two places. One is the class definition for data annotations. The other is the DB context for Fluent API. And I've seen some developers doing that, and it's really ugly. So the bottom line is, if you're working on an enterprise application, it's better to just stick to Fluent API. Yes, you write a little bit more code, but you have better separation of concerns, and you can configure all kinds of relationships using Fluent API. Okay, that's enough for now. Over the two next lectures, I'm going to cover data annotations and Fluent API in more detail.